everybody, I'm Mango Thunderslice, and today we're talking about NASA, the moon landing, JFK, and the flat Earth Psy-Op. Yeah, basically, this is it's a topic that seems to have been reinvigorated lately. China supposedly put a robot on the dark side of the moon, an unmanned mission on July 3rd. So a couple days ago, China put a robot on the far side of the moon. So it goes, it's the ultimate supposed proof of the moon landing is that you can go and you can look through a telescope and see where the landing took place, and the Chinese, I don't know how anybody's supposed to verify that beyond I guess NASA, but it's really interesting to examine all this moon stuff, because you have and especially in light of the flat earth topic, which we talked about a little bit in the previous video, you have people who get into conspiracies and then they question things and they realize how many things they've been lied to about, and they come to a point where they just think everything's a lie. And the flat earthers are literally those who think that everything is a lie. They'll believe in some scientific concepts, but in general, that's the point where you just lose faith in any and all things in the popular culture, in the mainstream, right? So the main people who are bashing and crushing on the flat earthers are usually people who accept the mainstream story with regard to the moon landing and historical events like the JFK assassination and 9/11 and plenty of other things. They accept the story of authority by default, right, until it's disproven, right? And there's a conspiracy type, which basically I'll just assume that it's false until it's proven, right? Which, you can't blame somebody for being in that, you can't blame somebody for being in that mindset at this point in history. But so this started with, I guess, a basketball player named Steph Curry saying to a former astronaut, Scott Kelly, that we didn't go to the moon. Right? On a podcast that aired last week, the NBA superstar said he doesn't believe that humanity actually landed on the moon. The offhand remark, which was echoed by several other NBA players on the podcast, went viral, prompting a wave of reaction from folks imploring Curry to clarify or repudiate his stance and to educate himself about NASA and spaceflight history. So, sure enough, basically as a public figure, who got into the conspiracy stuff and doesn't necessarily know enough to defend his position, and is in a position where if he were to really hold fast, he would be kicked out of the team, right? He would be excised from the mainstream culture. That's how things work, right? So eventually he recanted and said, okay, we probably went to the moon, blah, blah, blah. And then Owen Benjamin took up the fight, right? And he started doing all these live streams about we never went to the moon, and looking at the information regarding the moon landing, and with a critical eye. And he's gone full bore, accepting that the moon landing was probably faked. And this is a topic that I haven't really talked about too much, because at a certain point, it's like it's one of those articles of faith of the mainstream culture where you can't really bring it up with normal people, otherwise they think you're crazy. Like, it's something I'll only talk about with close friends. It's almost like the 9/11 thing. It's like, for those who actually are curious and critical minded, they've already gone and looked. It seems like there's very few people who are willing to know but haven't already gone and looked. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's a whole swath of new people that are receptive to the information, whereas once they weren't. And that's what's interesting about the coming out of characters like Owen Benjamin, who's until recently, within the last year or two, was a mainstream comedian who was totally in those cliques of Hollywood and all those high profile people. And now he's basically after the transgender kids thing, he got excised from that world, the way that Steph Curry would have if he had pressed forward. And so Owen is just going on about the moon, right, examining a lot of the information. Like, they supposedly destroyed, here, hold on. He's talking about the Van Allen belts. So there's these,
on the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on arrival. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice. Once up, once back.
Right. So talking about the Van Allen belts, there's the belts of charged particles in the surrounding environment of the planet. It's the radiation from the sun that essentially kind of collects in these eddies as it swirls around the magnetic field of the planet. So, there's the Van Allen belts, and there's supposedly an explanation of how these astronauts went through the Van Allen belts without getting fried. They say that the craft was lined with, slightly shielding materials, right? They say that even aluminum is able to repel, the charged particles, which, the thing about a lot of this is like with all the conspiracy stuff, whether it's JFK or the moon landing or 9/11, it's like they feed you a story which is like it's believable just enough. Like if you want to believe it, the story makes just enough sense to kind of hold that belief together and say, okay, that's plausible. It's interesting also to think that in 1969, when we supposedly went to the moon, there was like no such thing as a nerd, or at least like there was no such thing as computers. So the people who were really like nerds were like just math, okay? It wasn't like, oh, I'm playing around with computers and video games. None of that existed. Right. So my point is that now broadcasting technology, video technology, audio technology, signal frequencies with cell phones in our hand, the technology is now cultural, right? It is widespread, and it's in the common person's hands, and they can kind of understand the technology. Back then, nobody knew anything, so it's like the only people who could even, read some of these materials and understand what they were talking about at all were like the very people who were working on it. It's like a handful of people in the entire world who knows what any of this means, signals, and frequencies and all that stuff. So yeah, Owen Benjamin goes on a deep dive into the moon landing, and he's convinced that we didn't go to the moon. It's very interesting because they destroyed all of the telemetry data. NASA destroyed all of the information pertaining to the actual flight and the measurements of the systems on board. Like they said that they ran out of tapes. Like this is an agency that like has billions and billions of dollars per year, but apparently they were supposed to believe they didn't have enough for tapes to save arguably the most valuable data set ever created in the history of the human species, right? We recorded over it with Nickelodeon. Okay, yeah, sure. That's almost one of the biggest circumstantial points of evidence for the case that we didn't go to the moon, is that they want us to believe that the information was just deleted of the actual flight. Like seriously, can name a data set that would be more valuable than those tapes, assuming that we went to the moon. It is insane to think that was recorded over. And then, Owen Benjamin plays some other videos of scientists who say that, we destroyed the technology that allowed us go to we had the technology, but then we destroyed it. And, that's ridiculous, right? They're talking about solving all these problems for the Orion mission, getting out of low Earth orbit. But speaking as if these problems weren't already solved, like 50 years ago, right? And, why would we have to solve any of these problems over again with the Van Allen belts and whatnot if we already solved them when we got to the moon, right? And there's not necessarily a good explanation for that. They're kind of just like, trying to gloss over it and, oh, now we're working on a new project. But, it's like, hello, didn't we already go to the moon? So basically, one of the things that Owen brings up that I never really thought about before I know I've seen the conspiracy documentaries, and I know about the theory of, Kubrick was recruited to fake the landing. There was a documentary about it, I think called Room 237. What's interesting is that documentary, I remember watching it a few years ago, and it was extremely compelling, and it was basically making that perfect case that Stanley Kubrick was involved with it. And then I went and looked for the video like a couple years later, and it was a totally different documentary. And the point it was making was so vapid and retarded. It was like, oh, Kubrick was talking about cowboys and Indians and the history of the United States in The Shining, right? The Shining supposedly is like a cryptic description of Kubrick's involvement with faking the moon landing. And, how he starts to lose his mind being involved with that whole crazy upside down world. And then of course he released a movie called Eyes Wide Shut, which was all about secret societies, Illuminati, shady stuff, and that he died shortly after that in suspicious circumstances. So there's a lot of interesting stuff with this one. This is one of the archetypal conspiracies. Right, but one of the things Owen talks about is a great point, is how did they exactly broadcast a live TV stream from the frickin' moon in 1969 when it takes huge satellite arrays and transmitting stations to transmit TV stations from one point on Earth to another point on Earth today, right? If you need these huge powered equipment to transmit a signal here on Earth, how is this little lunar module transmitting a signal back to Earth, a live TV stream? I mean, that's insane. When it's like it's hard enough to do a live stream when you've got like an internet connection and everything hooked up properly. So, and that guy went on a little deep dive into this with the Deep Space Instrumentation Facility. This is supposedly in the story of how we broadcast a TV signal from the moon. It's basically this system, the Deep Space Instrumentation Facility, big dish, and this is the backbone of how not just the moon landing and a moon mission was supposedly communicated, but also all of the satellites which are, in deep space and outside of the Earth's orbit, right? And they invented this system. It was called the Unified S-band. Where'd it go? So USB, the Unified S-band system. So, and supposedly, they basically merge all of the different signals, the voice, the command, the telemetry, the biomedical, all this, they fuse into kind of one signal, and each one has their kind of sub-signals that gets filtered out when it gets down to the ground, right? And all those separate signals are modulated out in their own way. And so, that one signal becomes all the different signals, and that way you use less power. You can kind of have a coherent signal, and the other signals are just kind of all riding on that carrier signal. So this is basically the NASA document talking about the Apollo Unified S-band system, and it's just kind of a basic document overlooking the system, right? This paper describes the Apollo Unified S-band system. Talks about the parameters of the equipment. It is intended for those people who would like a general understanding of the USB system, but who do not intend to work in the detailed engineering phases of the program. So, and I was reading this, and what's interesting, okay, so here basically you see what it does. So ground to spacecraft, voice, digital commands and ranging signals, spacecraft to ground, voice, telemetry, television, biomedical data, ranging, emergency voice, and emergency key. And that's all well and good. Talks about the stations on the ground in Canberra and Goldstone. So there were all these different stations across the Earth to receive and send these signals. And the one thing that I just found was interesting, to Owen's point, is how exactly was this transmitted? What sort of power was powering the system that they used for this? And here I get down here of the spacecraft USB characteristics, and if you'll notice, the power amplifier on this thing is 20 watts. 20 watts. Okay, I replaced a light bulb last night, a 60-watt light bulb. So they're saying that basically the USB power amplifier on the spacecraft required 20 watts. Okay, and at first I thought I was maybe reading this wrong. Is this like 20 kilowatts? Like, am I just am I a layman who's just totally reading this wrong? But no, straight up, it says down here, it explains it, and it is just a 20-watt power amplifier that supposedly sent a signal. What, like 100? What's this distance from Moon to Earth? 238,900 miles. They're saying that a 20 watt power supply, power amplifier, was able to send a signal 238,000 miles, 239,000 miles. That's pretty extraordinary claim, right? And so here we have the FM television, 500 kilocycles, so 500 hertz, or 500 kilohertz, essentially, for the signal for that, 320 lines at 10 frames per second. So, that was the other thing. I went back and watched the original CBS broadcast of the moon landing, and I've never actually watched the footage. I know I've seen stills, they talk about it in school, blah, blah, blah. It just, watching it, it just seemed like the fakest thing in the world. It seemed so insanely just cartoonish, and they've got this, simulation of what this lunar lander is supposedly doing. They've got this countdown, as I guess somehow they were able to calculate exactly when the lander was going to touch down on the moon. And then basically the thing is, it films them getting out of the lander, and one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And so the image is complete crap, right? It's it's such a grainy signal that it's almost impossible to disprove or prove that this is actual the moon. I mean, because it's like when you've got a grainy photograph, it's hard to prove what is in the photograph. Right, and so people, I'm not going to get into all the Kubrick stuff and analyzing the photos. Plenty of documentaries out there doing that. I just thought this was fascinating of the frequency. They're supposedly transmitting a television signal on 500 kilohertz, which is basically what was used for Morse code, right? It is not a very high frequency signal, and so they're saying that this was able to transmit a television signal. Okay, I mean, I'm not like a signals expert. I mean, I guess that's possible. It's not a super high frequency signal, and the image is super low quality. It's only 10 frames per second. So okay, that's just interesting, that the Morse code frequency is what they use to transmit a live television broadcast from the freaking moon, 240,000 miles from Earth, right, on a 20-watt power amplifier. That seems a little tenuous. Not to mention, again, there's the Van Allen belts, right? So there's belts of charged particles in between the Earth and Moon, setting aside the aspect of the astronauts getting cooked by this radiation. I mean, the charged particles will interfere with an electromagnetic signal, or a frequency signal, right? You can look at a radio blackout during sunspots, right? Radio blackout, sunspot. When the sun shoots off a solar flare, which is basically just charged particles as it resides in the Van Allen belts, for whatever face of the Earth is facing the sun during that time, it'll be a radio blackout. The ships can't use radio during that time. Solar flares, large eruptions of electromagnetic radiation, increased level of X-ray and extreme ultraviolet. Under normal conditions, high-frequency radio waves are able to support communication over long distances. When a strong enough solar flare occurs, ionization is produced in the lower, more dense layers of the ionosphere. The radio waves that interact with electrons in layers lose energy due to the more frequent collisions that occur in higher density environment of the D layer. This can cause HF radio signals to become degraded or completely absorbed. This results in a radio blackout, the absence of high-frequency communication, primarily impacting the 3 to 30 megahertz band. So, okay, I mean, that's, again, you've got 500 kilohertz transmitting the TV signal. You've got a bunch of the other signals from the USB system in the 3 to 30 megahertz band, all of which are being powered by a 20-watt power amplifier, and they're going through belts of charged radiation that would interrupt the signal. Granted, you've got the actual receiving stations. So I use this as one of the photos over here on the left. So they've got a big power dish receiving, but they've only got 20 watts powering the signal. Maybe they're using the moon as part of the signal transmission, the moon becomes an amplifier of the signal, right? I don't know. Again, I'm just a layman, but it's really hard for me to believe that a 20-watt system can send a 500 kilohertz TV signal through belts of charged radiation in 1969, and people just watched the moon landing on their TV. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the thing is, I'm willing to believe that's possible, And I'm even willing to believe that it was possible in 1969. But it's very hard to believe that with this story and this technology that they're telling us about, that this was actually the technology that allowed us to go to the moon. It just doesn't seem entirely plausible at a certain point. So then we go to this document, which is kind of the more technical version of the document about the unified S-band used on the Apollo missions. And let me see. So equipment characteristics. Okay. And so this is where we get into, so it talks about, so the receiving stations are 20 kilowatts. Okay, that's what I was expecting almost for the lunar module, to project a signal from the freaking moon, 240,000 miles away, through charged particle belts. I would expect on the order of kilowatts, but basically they're saying 20 kilowatts to power the signal at the ground. And then, so basically here's the technical document. They talk about how there's a 2-foot parabolic antenna on the spacecraft, on the lunar module, and then supposedly a 10-foot parabolic antenna that is stowed during the flight, and then supposedly was erected on the lunar surface before the TV signal could be transmitted. The thing is, if I remember correctly, the TV signal shows Neil Armstrong getting out of the lunar module and touching the ground. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. So if he had to get out of the lunar module to set up the 10-foot antenna to transmit a TV signal, how did the TV signal show him getting out of the lunar module? You see what I'm saying? You know, even when you set aside the bigger conspiracy aspects, when you really kind of dive into the story of how this supposedly happened, it's just kind of, at a certain point, it seems like a cover story. You know, I believe that we did go to the moon, but not with this technology, and that there's probably, you know, there's the real space, program, and then there's the fake space program. And I think NASA is like the fake space program. It's like a movie studio kind of getting people involved culturally, and they're even making t-shirts with the NASA logo on it now. It's become this whole cultural thing in movies and whatnot. Right, NASA is part of the plan, right, the Iron Mountain Report on the possibility and desirability of peace as one of the ways for the New World Order, for global government to replace the function of war, to have orienting axis for people in a global society, right? Because with the advent of nuclear weapons, total war can no longer exist. At a certain point, the nation state can no longer exist if there's not a function of war making, right? And so they're trying to replace war making with space flight. Anyway, right, that's just my theoretical commentary on it. But yeah, so a 10-foot parabola, and this confirms, right, what the other document said, that on the lunar module it's powered by 20 watts. Down at the ground, 20 kilowatts, but they've got a third of a light bulb powering a 2-foot antenna, right? And then supposedly when he got to the moon, he unfolded a 10-foot antenna. And that's what was able to do it. So to answer Owen's question, yeah, basically it was less than half of a light bulb powering a tiny antenna. And that's what allowed all of that to happen. You can decide if that's believable or not. And that's, again, the thing. I'm a layman. I can't say provably that that's not possible. And I believe that there are ways to communicate with all the satellites, right, and spacecraft in deep space. But again, 20 watts for real? I don't know, man. Anyway, then we get into basically, electric universe and gravity, and basically, how is it, again, for those who've been watching my videos for a long time, from the ether physics days, you'll know that I've seen a UFO. I saw a UFO in broad daylight when I was 7 years old. So I've always known that the scientific model that they're feeding us is complete bullshit, right? It is totally false. And I've seen no less than 100, UFOs, lights in the sky, usually at nighttime, since that time when I was 7. And so there is a theory, there is a conception of the universe that actually works and explains these things. And it's not relativity, it's not Einstein. And it's something else. And for me, the closest thing that I can find, the most coherent description of this new paradigm, is the electric universe, the Thunderbolts project, right? So here's Wal Thornhill's explanation of electric gravity, that essentially there's centripetal spiraling of electricity into the planet, that it's the orgone field, it's the etheric field. Let me see, I'll skip ahead a little bit to Dan Winter. I know some of you guys are familiar with Dan Winter. about a fractal space-time, right? Dan Winter presents compelling and systematic scientific evidence that fractality in space and time is the specific mechanism and cause of gravity, biologic negentropy, so increasing order and coherence, life force perception, and human bliss. Right, and Dan Winter's great. Dan Winter's absolutely great. So this fractal recursion of charge, this spiraling vortex into the planet of electric current coming from the sun, right? And so this creates a dipole, right? And it creates a non-coherent like electromagnetic pulling, right? And so it bends them into a dipole, and it causes the attractive force of gravity, right? Eric Dollard, The History and Theory of Electricity. This is an absolute primer for those who are looking into the real conception of physics, that the real understanding of electricity. And again, when you take these all back, it becomes a very spiritual concept, right? And what I love about Eric Dollard is he is absolutely an engineer, but he is also he takes the knowledge to its supreme point where basically he understands spiritual concepts from a physics perspective. And again, it's about coherence of signal, it's about energy, right? It's about the orgone force, the etheric force. He understands what the ether is, as did Tesla, as did all the great minds who actually created this world, right? And now we just have technicians who are maintaining hardware who don't even understand what electricity is or how it works, right? And so yeah, electrogravitics, right? This is how I believe, with that aforementioned having been said, right? T. Townsend Brown and electrogravitics, supposedly Tesla figured out how to manipulate gravity, and this technology was ignored by the U.S. Bankers and national security state, but it was taken up by the Nazis. And then with Project Paperclip at the end of World War II, right, the Germans lost the war, but the Nazis won the war, right? And they came over and they became NASA. Wernher von Braun, total Nazi, right? They were all brought over. So it's like, yeah, Tesla invented it, the bankers shunned him, it went over to Germany, Germany made all this crazy technology, Project Paperclip brings it back over to the United States, and they create NASA, right? And they make a secret space program on the back end, and they're, colonizing the solar system most likely. And we're fed this cartoon Mickey Mouse version of the space program, and that's how we get things like the Apollo project and the space shuttle and all these things. And I believe that there probably is an International Space Station. There are plenty of people working on it who are actually doing real work here. But at a certain point, there's like an echelon of people who know that like most of it is like a total just movie set and it's totally fake, right? We can get into space, but it's like you'll see some of these videos, right, of bubbles during spacewalks. Like, how's there a bubble in space? They're saying that it's filmed underwater and whatnot, right? You'll see one video where there's an astronaut guy floating out and he's wearing a spacesuit and then he turns his helmet. It's like in no other video does any helmet turn. Helmets aren't supposed to turn. They're like fixed and locked. But anyway, so there's all these anomalies to the videos that NASA puts out, and that feeds the flat earthers. They say, oh, NASA makes fake videos. That means that everything is fake and the earth is flat. It's like, no, hang on. Let's take one thing at a time here. Just because NASA is making fraudulent videos and is not being perfectly genuine with their role in the real space program does not mean that the earth is flat. Just time out real quick. I'll take claim by claim on their own merit. Right, electrogravitics, very interesting. And this is interesting also, is that UFOs, they basically kind of rose exponentially in their sightings up till about 2012 and peaked actually in 2014. And since that time, we have had an exponential decrease in the sightings of UFOs. This is very interesting. People have also commented on how there's been fewer spraying of the sky with the aerosols, aka the chemtrails, And, there's this whole theory that ties into how Trump came to power and all this crazy QAnon stuff and, secret space program and everything that Jordan Sather is talking about, that basically, there's all these different fiefdoms in the deep state, the real deep state. And that basically there was kind of a war on the back end, right? A secret war between different factions of the deep state, right? And so the theory goes that Trump is part of one of those factions, which, for those who are more optimistic are calling the White Hats, saying that they are more benevolent minded than the other faction, which is, probably the faction that Hillary Clinton and the rest of the deep state goons and swamp creatures are on. And, they're involved with all sorts of crazy things, human trafficking, drug trafficking. The thing also is this whole secret space program and deep state black budget requires a whole bunch of operations to keep it funded. You can't just print the money. You have to rebalance the system. And that's the Eurodollar system. That's the drug war, right? The drug war isn't just about bringing drugs into the United States. It's about getting dollars out of the United States, right? And this is an extremely complex topic. I'll put links down below to some of the books that I've relied on for a lot of this perspective building. AIDS, Opium, Diamonds, and Empire by Dr. Nancy Turner Banks. I've read plenty of chapters from that book as videos on this channel, some about AIDS, and it's a fascinating book. She talks about the JFK assassination as well, and specifically Jackie, his wife, Jackie Kennedy, and what she did after Kennedy was killed. Very interesting stuff, this conspiracy. It's so entertaining. Again, if you can hold your mind together and not become a flat earther, it's all very fascinating. So that's very interesting, assuming that there's this war in the deep state and fighting factions, blah, 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 that, maybe there was some sort of agreement reached, or, it's not the same as it was. Something snapped, something happened. And again, I don't think these are alien craft. I have no real evidence to believe that they are, especially knowing what I know about actual electrogravitics and history of electrical technology, and that we can make these. The proof is in the pyramids, right? And I don't believe that aliens made the pyramids either. I think that we humans did. And it's using a technology that we once had and that we do have again, but it's only being held in the secret space program. And there's a few people around this world who are working on that problem, one of whom is Eric Dollard, right? And trying to rebuild that culturally known unified field theory involving the ether, involving basically spiritual conceptions of the force that unites the universe. And the technical aspect of that is basically electrogravitics and being able to manipulate gravity and fly throughout the universe, right? Because the ether is like the sea, right? A boat, you can travel wherever you want to go with a boat that's on water, right? And the ether is a different kind of water. If you can tread that water, you can go anywhere, right? See where I'm going? Negentropy, again, Dan Winter, right? Of gravity as the fractal recursion of charge within the ether, creating gravity, creating the orgone force that powers life forms and consciousness. And absolutely fascinating. So I encourage you guys to follow some of these rabbit holes. Beware the flat earth, right? The earth is not flat. You can tell just by looking at the star trails. They rotate around two focal points of the North Pole and the South Pole. It does not matter if you think that the horizon looks flat. It does not, by the way. It is not flat. You can see videos on YouTube of cruise ships going beneath the horizon, not further and further into the distance, getting smaller, right? To those of you who have ever sun gazed, right? When you watch the sun on a sunset, it does not recede and get smaller into the distance. It goes beneath the horizon without losing any apparent magnitude or diameter, right? There's plenty of proofs that the Earth is round without relying on NASA. That being said, NASA is largely a fraudulent organization. Did we go to the moon? Probably, but I don't think that the Apollo mission is how that was done, right? And there's plenty of evidence for the case that that is true, right? The fact that they would have destroyed the telemetry data, I mean, let's think of this like a detective. If somebody destroys evidence like that, I mean, do you think Hillary Clinton destroyed her emails because she just wanted more hard drive space? Is that really plausible? Because that's what they're telling us with this moon landing is, oh, we needed the tapes for, my kid wanted to tape Teletubbies, so we typed over the moon landing telemetry data. Like, that is so insane and so implausible. It's like the magic bullet for Kennedy, or, the pancake collapse for 9/11, or all these different things. They feed you a story that's like tenable enough for those who want to believe, for those who are in the brainwash program. But as soon as you start looking critically, you snap and basically you realize this is nonsense. But then again, they're the authorities, so you're questioning the authorities, right? It's almost like they make these stories intentionally ridiculous at a certain level because they know that it'll fracture the society. They know that they'll create two classes within the society. One that believes ridiculous stories because the authority told them, right? The good and willing slaves that will lick their master's hand that feeds them. And then there's basically those others who will question the story that is ridiculous, and they get branded a conspiracy theorist and ostracized within the society. So you have the smartest people in the society getting pushed to the periphery, and you have the dumbest, most lobotomized, weakest minds inhabiting the core. And that's why we see the fake news media and all the sycophants working within it and all the idiots who lap that stuff up and think that it's reality. And we have people who are actually smart and intelligent basically being called crazy people for believing what their eyes tell them and believing in logic and rationality. And I think that's deliberate. And I think that in order to transcend that, we have to learn the truth without losing our minds. And again, that's part of the theme of this channel. Learn the truth without losing your mind. Or at least have fun while you're doing it, I guess. Anyway, that's my video today. Let me know what you guys think about the moon landing, about Owen Benjamin, about secret space program, electrogravitics, and the life force that unifies the entire cosmos in a coherent field, right? The unified field. May the force be with you, because the force is the ether. Much love to you guys. I will see you next time. Cheers.
Ah.